But that's part of the charm, having to control this two-dimensional spaceship with a trackball. Because it's the worst possible way to control a spaceship, maybe. But that's what made it really hilariously fun. I just got a bit of water on my face there. Hello and welcome back to the hydrate corner, the water corner, break, water. It's something about water. This show is about water. So recently there's been some controversy in the whole fighting game tournament scene because of a controller that came out that people were making on their own, customizing their own controllers based on a layout known as the hitbox, which has actually been around for, as far as I'm aware, over a decade. But for some reason, people hadn't figured out then what way could it be built that it could actually provide an unfair advantage to the players, to the point that bringing a certain hitbox to a tournament actually resulted in Daigo being unable to use that controller because they just decided right before the tournament, actually you can't use that controller. And then it sparked off lots of debate about what controller is fair and what isn't fair with regards to fighting games. And it really made me think, because I personally, and I've made multiple videos about this in the past, I have made videos about how I'm a big fan of the arcade stick. Now, you know, on this channel, I've actually made videos about the Mixbox. You know, I play games on a standard PlayStation pad, but there was discussion about fighting games to the point that it was like, it doesn't matter what controller you use. And of course, I've talked about this. I choose to play on stick because to me, playing on stick is the game. I don't mind if other people don't use stick. I haven't reached that point where I'm like, you're not even playing the same game as me. I don't mind. If you want to play the mind games, if to you the fighting game is all about the mind games and guessing games, or if you're more worried about anticipating exactly what move I'm going to do next, maybe for you, the mind games are the fighting game. But I think there is a limit. There is a point at which there could be a controller which kind of messes it all up, which is why there are rules that say you're not allowed to have macros. For example, even if you use a pad, or you use a stick, to do the fireball motion, you still have to go down, forward, punch on a PlayStation pad. Or if you're on a stick, you need to go down, forward, punch on the actual stick. But what you're not allowed to do, as far as I'm aware from the rules, is you're not allowed to press the programming function and program down forward punch into just a single shortcut button so that every time you press this one button, you do the fireball. Because the game has been programmed so that it does take a little bit of extra time. There is some input that is required for the game to do the fireball motion. If you could do it instantly, then they would have to rebalance that character so that you are weaker in other ways. And there are characters in Street Fighter that have one-button commands, or you just hold down the button and then when you need to do that move, you just let go, so it's really, really fast. But those characters will be weaker in other ways to keep them balanced. And so there definitely are limits, and people are quite aware that there are certain things like macros which could make it completely unfair. But I actually started to think, actually it's not so crazy to say that in this tournament we want you to only use pad, or that in this tournament we want you to only use stick. Of course, that means that if you happen to only have one arm and using a controller where it's massively widely spaced out like this makes it difficult to play with one hand, that does mean it becomes an exclusive activity at that point. But what got me thinking about this more was the fact that certain games consoles have things like motion controls, or in virtual reality, your whole body is the controller. Or in a dancing game, you have to do it with arrows placed on the floor, because obviously, if you just played a dancing game with your thumbs, it might be a million times easier, but it would be missing the point entirely, right? And so to look at a game that was designed around a certain type of controller, and then to say it doesn't matter what the controller is, it's probably missing a large part of a very possible argument about the fact that fighting games, in my opinion, are not a genre. To me, I think fighting games are like a family of genres, where of course it started as like a Wii game. Let's say you had a lightsaber game where you used your Nintendo Wiimotes as virtual lightsabers. And then in the future we had a version of that same game that we could play with analog sticks. And so it's a completely different motion system, but we're still enjoying the game and we're able to do it now on controllers. But if you were to compete with someone using motion controls versus someone using analog controls, and the analog controller always won, well, you end up with a situation like ARMS. Because wasn't it like ARMS was the game that you could play on the Switch with motion controls, but it just ended up being easier to do it on analog stick? And so I think prescribing what controller is required for a tournament could be really interesting, actually, rather than always coming down to this one blanket argument. It doesn't matter what controller you use. And so what I think causes this discussion to be difficult is that at the very start, there actually only was one controller. There was no home console version, and in the arcades, you couldn't bring a pad and Bluetooth it or USB it to the arcade system. You can now, but at the time, the whole point of the game was that you play this in a game center, in a public place with this controller. There was no other way to do it, and so we had an equal understanding of how we're going to fight on this tournament. We're gonna have the same equal terms. But as fighting games started getting ported to the console, we got almost as good versions as the arcade games in our homes, to the point that we ended up with releases of fighting games that never got arcade releases in the actual arcades themselves. For example, Street Fighter V, which does have an arcade release now, but that's after 3 years of doing its best to be a popular console game. And then eventually they said, hey, let's make it an arcade version as well. Actually, who knows? That might have been on the roadmap this whole time. We may never know whether that was in the plans right from the start. And so the timeline was that it started in the arcades, then it was on arcades and consoles, and then they became equal, and then it became console only for certain games, and no arcade port. And so of course it makes sense to take seriously all the controllers that can be used on a home console, but it has come far, far away from the game that was based on you play with these rules and with these controllers. Now it's you play the game with these rules, and we can't really control what controller you use. And instead of just saying that fighting games have to be like this, where we can't control what controllers you've got, it could be more interesting to have both. A system where the game rules and the controller are set, or a system where the game rules and you can use any controller you want. It's a completely different competition, and we're testing whether you have mastered this controller or not. And the only reason I say this is because I think by saying that any controller should be allowed, and that it is all about the mind games, actually reduces the number of interesting hype moments that we can have. Whereas if we become open to the idea that a prescribed controller system and a non-prescribed controller system could coexist, then we could have a much wider variety of entertainments and forms of entertainment. Because if we say that it doesn't matter what controller you use, then we're saying that the fighting game is only the mind games, the anticipation, the prediction, the knowledge, the frame data. There's a lot of things that go into a fighting game that have nothing to do with the controller. But looking back on historical videos, like the famous Moment 37, if you watch that video now, it still requires that you understand that it looked difficult, and that was a big part of why that was impressive. To be able to move something which is got this much, it's got a wide range of motion, to be able to do this at exactly the right moments in order to parry all of those hits of that combo and then win the match. It's the difficulty that made it kind of impressive, right? And of course, if you had a hitbox, it would still be very, very difficult because you still need to time the directions, even though it's now on a button. There's maybe less range of motion, but you still need quite a lot of precision to do it. Anyway, it's something that I'd like to talk about in more detail in a coffee video, but it's something that I had on my mind while I was working today. And I haven't had a lot of time to shoot other videos today because I'm still moving into my house and all that. But really, I think fighting games are holding themselves back if they put too much emphasis on the fact that the mind games are the game. Because of course, mind games are a massive, no doubt, the most important part of fighting games today. But if more tournaments were set up where it was like, you've got to play on a controller here, or this is a pad-only tournament, or this is a hitbox-only tournament, and we start talking about the ways that we control the game as being part of the rules, then we open up a massive new family of genres where fighting games, mind games, are not the whole game. Instead, it could be mind games plus wiggling a stick, or mind games plus playing around on a controller, or mind games and toggling these hitboxes, or mind games and motion control. Fighting games have the opportunity to expand beyond one single genre to being a family of genres. You know, fighting games have been so obsessed with themselves being like a speed chess that we don't allow the game to pause. But wouldn't it be interesting if we had a fighting game where if you built up enough meter, you could get your moment to pause the battle and go into that Matrix mode that's coming in Final Fantasy Remake, and then do some turn-based decisions, or you could open up your tablet and launch some battleships and stuff. So fighting game until you get your V trigger and then it becomes a turn-based RPG. I don't know, there could be a lot of other things that fighting games could become. But the genre will always resist change if it thinks that by bringing something new on, it needs to say goodbye to something else. And so by saying that fighting games are mind games and only about the mind games, and that it doesn't matter what controller you use, then even though it sounds like the fighting game genre is evolving, what's actually happening is you're just closing off a lot of the really interesting parts of what fighting games used to be, instead of opening up a new option. Wouldn't it be more interesting to have both? Anyway, I don't even know how often it's said. It just seems to me that it's being said a lot. That it's not about the controller and that it really absolutely does not matter what controller you're using. But in my opinion, a lot about gaming in general is knowing what controller was intended to be used with this game, and that's what makes it really interesting. So I think that's how I feel about it in general with all game genres, really, where all these games and their rules are continuing to get more and more complex to the point that it starts to not matter what controller you're using because there's so much complexity in just the rules and the mind games of the game itself. I just feel like if that's the trend, then in general, gaming has become like less interesting as a result. Or it's missing out on what made gaming really interesting to start with. And actually part of the reason why I think virtual reality is like a return to caring really hard about what controller you use. Because if you could play Beat Saber with analog sticks and instead of like motion captured lightsabers, then it would be a million times less interesting. It would be its own form of new interesting, but it would be missing out on the whole effort of using lightsabers to do something which takes a lot of effort to do. I mean, I just feel this with all of my Steam games. Almost every game that I have on my PC has a keyboard version. You can play this game on keyboard, or you can play it on gamepad if you have one, or you can play it on mouse and keyboard if you have one. And that is fantastic. It's really important that accessibility continues to expand and all games become more accessible to as many people as possible. I just feel like we're missing out a bit recently on games that are very specific about exactly what controller you have to use. And that game designers shouldn't be afraid to make games that are kind of exclusive. Games that are massively wide open and accessible, there will always be tons of them now, and I'm really glad about that. I think that is really, really important. But I love the idea of games that have to be controlled a certain way, and that's what makes they were really, really difficult and pointlessly difficult maybe, but that's part of the charm. Having to control this two-dimensional spaceship with a trackball, because it's the worst possible way to control a spaceship maybe, but that's what made it really hilariously fun and interesting. So yeah, that's basically the point I'm trying to say. Accessibility is massively important, so we must never let go of that, but games that are prescriptive about exactly what controller must be used for it have a very special charm, and I'd like to see more of them, basically. And I think that fighting games could go beyond being a genre to being a whole family of new genres, subgenres. Fighting games that are mind game only, and fighting games that are mind games and specifically require that you use this controller to use them, to play them, whatever. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments as usual, and I will see you in the next NihongoGamer video. Don't forget to join the Discord, comment, subscribe, share the video and all that great stuff, and like the video if you want to, and click the bell. Apparently it's really important that you click the subscription bell. There's actually two different versions of bell now. There's the bell that means that YouTube will send you all notifications on YouTube, and there's like another bell, which is, I don't know if it's hollow and it's like white or it's just an outline, I'm not sure. That one will only notify you of updates from this channel. I don't know, it's kind of complicated, but you'll find a way. Just click the bell a few times and figure out which option is the right one for you. I'll see you in the next NihongoGamer video.